There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. The author of the book of Joshua is never mentioned in the Bible, though we assume it was written by Joshua. But even if it was written by Joshua, there are things in this book that Joshua couldn't have written, like about his death and about all of these memorials that are included in the book of Joshua, where they left all these monuments that God told them to place in areas where these great events occurred that God had performed. And in the book, it says, they remain to this day. So that was speaking about a future time when those monuments were still there in Israel. And Joshua is also the very first book in the Bible to ever be named after a person. And this book, it's all history. This is the historical record of the events that happened after Moses' death. And although this is not a book that was written by Moses, the book of Joshua is actually just a continuation of the same story of Moses and is connected to the book of Deuteronomy, where we read in our New King James Version in chapter 1, it starts after the death of Moses. But if we were reading this in the original King James Version, it would start with the word now. But then if you looked at the Hebrew Bible, the book of Joshua starts with the Hebrew word and, where in Hebrew it says, and it came to pass after the death of Moses. So this is just a continuation of the story from Deuteronomy chapter 34. And so this flows right into the next book, connecting this book by the use of that word and. But even though this book of Joshua is a historical book, it was also given as an example of our deliverance from the bondage of sin, where everything that Israel had gone through since Egypt had been a type of our life in Jesus Christ, which is explained to us by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians. And so if you remember when we were studying the book of Exodus, that for us Christians, Israel's deliverance from their slavery in Egypt was an example of our deliverance from our slavery, from our sin in the world. And where we were freed from sin and death by the blood of our Lamb, Jesus Christ, they were freed from their slavery and their death at the Passover by the blood of the Lamb that was placed on their doorposts. And then you have to remember all of Israel, when they went through the Red Sea after being saved, that they were all baptized. That was considered a baptism for the nation of Israel. Just like after we're saved, we're all baptized. And then now we get to Israel's wandering in the wilderness because of their unbelief and their disobedience. And this is all after being saved. That's like us. That's like when we wander. When we wander because of our unbelief and our disobedience after our being saved. Where we refuse to enter into the life that God has prepared for us. We refuse to enter into our promised land. And that's when we desire to return to our old life and back to our Egypt, to go back to our bondage, where we dwell on those things that we used to like, our old lifestyles. And for Israel, they'll mention things like the leeks and the garlic and the cucumbers. But for us, it may be things like the drugs and the alcohol, maybe the rock and roll. So instead of being conquerors, we become these wanderers in a wilderness where, yes, we are God's people. Yes, we are saved, but we're not living in the promised land that God has for us. And so now here we have Israel, and they're about to cross over the Jordan River. And they're just about to enter the promised land after this 40 years of their wandering in the wilderness. All right, so our Christian heritage, they wrote some songs, and it portrays this crossing over Jordan and entering the promised land. And it's been this image they've created of of our dying and crossing over and going to heaven. And so there's a lot of Christian hymns like that. You have songs like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And it's about crossing over the Jordan and having these angels coming running after you to take you home up to heaven. And even though these are great songs, they don't really fit the image that God is trying to create here. Because entering the promised land isn't about going home to heaven. It's about being saved and beginning to live this successful Christian life here on earth. Canaan is not the place of our final rest. It's the place of victory for a believer in the midst of a world that's overrun by our enemies. And one of the biggest reasons that we know that the promised land here isn't heaven is because we won't be fighting battles in heaven. Heaven is not going to be filled with our enemies. Heaven is a place of peace and a place of rest. So entering the promised land is about saying goodbye to the old life and entering into the new life in this world, being led by Jesus Christ. And you have to see here, and it's not a coincidence, that the names of Jesus, the name of Jesus and the name of Joshua, they're identical. Joshua is just how you say Jesus in Hebrew. But to say the same exact name in the Greek, all you do is you say Jesus. And Israel, they received their promised land through Joshua, where Joshua will now be leading Israel into battle to claim their inheritance, where we too have been promised an inheritance in this life with specific promises only made to us, and we will be led by our Joshua, where our Jesus will lead us into battle to claim our promises, where we claim these victories in our lives that have been under the control of the enemy. So we too, we will have to battle the enemy, and we too, we're going to have to labor. But just like Israel here, our victory is guaranteed. And you need to know this as believers. The only reason that we ever sin is because we want to. We never sin because we have to. And when we battle our enemies following Jesus and we defeat them and we take our promised land, we begin to live this fruitful life that's been promised to us in Jesus Christ. But just like many of the people, they died in the wilderness before they ever reached the promised land, many Christians, they will never walk in the fullness of the Christian life that God has prepared for them. Because this walk is a walk of faith and a walk of obedience. And so the book of Joshua starts here with Moses being dead. And you have to remember that Moses, he represented the law, and the law could never lead the people of God into the promised land. Rules, they can't bring the promises of life and the promises of rest. It's only the grace of God through faith in Jesus that can do that. So this book of Joshua, this is a book of new beginnings for the people of God. It's a new beginnings for these people who have just spent the last 40 years of their life wandering around in the wilderness following Moses, where now everyone who was over the age of 60, everyone who had rebelled against God's plan to enter the land of Canaan, they've all now died. And there's only two people left of that generation. That's Joshua and Caleb. And they were the only two spies that believed God could bring Israel into the promised land. So this is a new generation of the children of Israel. So these are not the same slaves that left Egypt, but they're a people that are made up of the children of the slaves who left Egypt. And for Joshua, Moses would have been a very difficult man to follow being their new leader, because Moses, he won't ever be forgotten. And you're going to hear Moses' name mentioned in the book of Joshua over 50 times. And even though Moses is dead, the work still continues. And although Joshua is no Moses, God has been preparing Joshua his whole life for his ministry. And this is the first time we ever read about the Lord ever speaking to Joshua. And God is not speaking to a young man here. Joshua here is over 85 years old. And that tells us that Joshua, that he was only 5 years old when Moses murdered the Egyptian and fled from Egypt. And so that means that Joshua, he was born as a slave in Egypt, and he was born during the most terrible of circumstances in Egypt. And his name from birth, it wasn't Joshua, but it was Oshua, which means salvation. But Moses, he changed his name and he added the word Yah in front of his name. And Yah, it means Jehovah. So instead of meaning salvation, he changed it to Jehovah is salvation. And Joshua is the exact same name as Jesus. And so Joshua, he lived this life of a slave until the age of 45, until that very first Passover with the death of the firstborn in Egypt. And then if you go on in the Bible, you'll read in 1 Chronicles in chapter 7:27 that Joshua himself, that he was one of the firstborn sons. So that means that Joshua, that he was delivered that night at Passover from death when his father, Nun, from the tribe of Ephraim, put that blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their home. So that night, Joshua, he wasn't only delivered from a life of bondage, of being a slave in Egypt, but he was also delivered from death, along with all the other firstborn of Israel. And so that also means that Joshua was about 45 years old when he saw all those plagues that poured out on Egypt, and that he also walked on the dry ground when God split the Red Sea into two. And he also saw all the dead bodies of the Egyptians on the shoreline when God had brought that sea back down on Pharaoh's soldiers. And so Joshua knew, like all of Israel knew, that God could deliver his people. But Joshua, he wasn't a soldier. He was just a slave. So he was never trained as a soldier or to lead armies. But the very first time that we see him in scriptures is in Exodus 17, where Moses picked Joshua to lead a bunch of slaves in battle against Amalek. And this is only 2 months after Israel left Egypt. And I don't think at this time that he probably knew that he was being trained by God to lead armies, but God had a course for Joshua and for his life. And then the next time we see Joshua, we see him in Exodus 24, when Israel is camping out at Mount Horeb around Mount Sinai, where Joshua was picked as Moses' personal assistant. So he became Moses' gopher. He became Moses' personal errand boy. And Joshua, he was called up on the mountain with Moses when Moses received the 10 Commandments. And even though he didn't get to see God writing on the stone, it did get Joshua to be able to escape that idolatry that Israel was committing down in the camp when Aaron made that golden calf. And so Joshua, he was not only the assistant to Moses, and he was not only just a military leader, but Joshua, he was also a worshiper of God, because he was the only one that we read about who chose to hang around outside of that tent that Moses set up outside of the camp where Moses met with God, where he was just hanging out and trying to listen into their conversations, because Joshua, he always wanted to be close to God. You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.